I'm sitting here in the studio looking at something I genuinely did not expect to see in my lifetime. And I've been covering geopolitics and institutional power for years. 38 military commanders, active duty and retired, including 7 four-star generals, have signed and released a joint public letter refusing to endorse the current commander-in-chief's handling of military authority. This letter dropped less than an hour ago. This is not a leak. This is not a rumor. This is a formal, on-the-record public statement from people who built their entire careers on one principle: you do not publicly challenge civilian leadership, ever. And the fact that they broke that rule deliberately, collectively on camera, tells you everything you need to know about what they believe is at stake. Subscribe to Daily Brief right now, because what's unfolding here is going to define the next several months of American political and institutional life. And you need the full picture before the spin machines on both sides start rewriting the story. Let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand why this moment is so seismic, you have to understand what it took to get here. For months, according to reporting from multiple outlets, including The Washington Post and Politico, senior military figures had been watching a pattern develop inside the command structure. Not a single incident, not a personality clash, a pattern. Promotion decisions that sources say increasingly factored in perceived political loyalty. Operational briefings where senior commanders were excluded when their previous assessments had contradicted administration messaging. And then the moment that apparently broke the dam entirely, a directive dated February 9th. According to the letter and to statements made at today's press conference at the National Press Club in Washington, the White House Chief of Staff placed a call to the Pentagon at 2:15 p.m. on February 9th. The acting Deputy Secretary of Defense was instructed to hold all authorization requests from 3 specific forward operating bases until further notice. When the Deputy Secretary asked for the reason, he was allegedly told, and this is the part that every legal expert I've seen respond to today called extraordinary, that certain commanding officers needed to demonstrate a better understanding of administration priorities before operational support could continue. Stop. Read that again. Operational support, equipment, authorizations, resupply logistics for troops in the field, allegedly conditioned on commanders showing political alignment. And 2 hours later, according to the letter, those same 3 base commanders received calls from a White House political advisor inviting them to appear in a televised roundtable on February 14th to publicly praise administration defense policies. The message, if the account is accurate, could not have been clearer: appear, endorse, and the authorizations move, don't appear, and your troops wait. Hit the like button if you understand why this became impossible to ignore. Now, I want to give you the critical historical context here, because this story only makes sense if you understand how deeply this breaks with everything the American military has stood for institutionally. Go back to April 1951. President Truman fires General Douglas MacArthur during the Korean War. MacArthur had publicly advocated for expanding the war into China, directly contradicting presidential orders. Truman removed him precisely to defend the principle of civilian control. And even MacArthur, who had massive public support, who was treated like a hero when he returned to the United States, accepted the decision because the constitutional principle was bigger than any one general. Moved to December 1993, General Colin Powell, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, disagrees with President Clinton over the implementation of the policy on gay service members. Powell testifies to Congress, he expresses concerns, he goes through proper channels, and then he executes the policy, because the line between offering advice and openly challenging civilian authority was one he never crossed. Move again to October 2019. Defense Secretary James Mattis resigns after President Trump orders a withdrawal from Syria without consulting Pentagon leadership. Mattis writes what becomes one of the most discussed resignation letters in American political history. He says the president deserves a defense secretary whose views are more aligned with his own, diplomatically devastating. But even then, Mattis maintained the tradition of not publicly attacking a sitting president for nearly 2 years after leaving office. Today is different. These 38 leaders did not wait for retirement. They did not use diplomatic language. They did not go through private channels or classified Senate testimony. They walked into the National Press Club, stood at a podium, and read a public statement on camera. According to reporting from multiple outlets in the room, the atmosphere was, in the words of one journalist present, unlike anything I've ever seen at a military-related press event. Standing at the podium was General Marcus Caldwell, retired four-star Army general and former Joint Chiefs Vice Chairman, flanked by Admiral Jennifer Hartley, retired Navy admiral who commanded the Pacific Fleet, and Lieutenant General Robert Hayes, retired Marine Corps officer who led forces in 3 combat theaters. General Caldwell read the opening statement. His words, as reported by Reuters and confirmed by pool reporters in the room, "We have served under presidents from both parties, and we have never publicly questioned civilian leadership. But we cannot remain silent when operational decisions that affect the safety of American service members are subordinated to political calculations." And then this line, the one that's already being quoted by constitutional scholars across the political spectrum. "The principle of civilian control of the military is sacred, but that control carries a responsibility to act in the national interest, not personal interest." That sentence is load-bearing because civilian control of the military is the argument typically used to defend presidential authority over the armed forces. These generals are not arguing against civilian control. They're arguing that what they witnessed was not civilian control. It was civilian exploitation. And that distinction is going to be at the center of every legal and constitutional debate that follows. Don't go anywhere, because the detail that comes next is the one that makes this not just a political crisis, but a national security question. According to Admiral Hartley's statement at today's press conference, one of the 3 forward operating bases that had its authorizations delayed was subsequently subjected to increased hostile fire on February 11th and 12th, just 48 hours after the White House directive. Hartley was careful and precise in her language. She explicitly stated there is no direct evidence linking the authorization delay to the security incident, but she also stated that the base commander had specifically requested enhanced defensive systems that were part of the delayed authorization package. Those systems were not in place when the attack occurred. 3 American service members were wounded. The base sustained significant damage to communications infrastructure. No fatalities, but that fact changes nothing about the question at the center of all of this. If the account is accurate, troops may have been at increased risk not because of strategic constraints, not because of budget limitations, not because of any legitimate military calculation, but because their commander hadn't agreed to appear on camera for a White House event. This is the moment where partisan framing becomes genuinely inadequate. This is not a Democrat versus Republican question. This is not a policy disagreement. This is a question about whether national defense is negotiable based on political considerations. And the answer to that question has to be the same regardless of who is in the White House and regardless of what you think of any particular president's policies. Subscribe to Daily Brief if you're not already, because we are going to be following every development on this story as it unfolds. Now let's talk about the legal dimension, because constitutional scholars and former federal officials have been responding to this in real time, and what they're saying matters enormously. Professor Elizabeth Warren, constitutional law expert at Georgetown University and former Assistant Attorney General, told CNN this afternoon that if the allegations are substantiated, there are questions about clear violations of the president's fundamental duties as commander-in-chief. Her words, "While the Constitution grants the president broad authority over military operations, that authority exists to serve national security objectives, not to extract political loyalty from officers who are supposed to provide independent professional military advice." Michael Chertoff, former federal judge and Homeland Security Secretary under President George W. Bush, added that the allegations could potentially implicate multiple federal statutes prohibiting the use of government resources for campaign purposes. Delaying military operations to coerce political endorsements from active duty commanders, in his framing, isn't just an abuse of authority. It could constitute violations of laws specifically designed to prevent political manipulation of military resources. And here's the detail that's being underreported in the initial wave of coverage, but is absolutely critical to understanding the full scope of what we're looking at. According to sources inside the Pentagon speaking to multiple reporters today, the 38 signatories represent only a fraction of the flag officers who wanted to participate. Military legal counsel reportedly advised at least a dozen additional active duty officers that signing the letter could constitute violations of Department of Defense regulations prohibiting political activity by uniformed personnel. They couldn't sign, not because they disagreed, because they're still serving and legally constrained. Think about what that means. The 38 who went public are the ones who could go public because they've retired. The ones currently in command positions, currently managing these pressures in real time, are watching from the sidelines, legally unable to add their voices. A retired 3-star general speaking to the Washington Post on condition of anonymity this evening confirmed that informal discussions among senior military leaders about how to respond to what they describe as accelerating politicization had been ongoing for at least 6 months. The group apparently considered every alternative: a private meeting with the president, working through the Secretary of Defense, classified testimony to the Senate Armed Services Committee. Each option had a fatal flaw. A private meeting could be dismissed without public accountability. The Secretary of Defense appeared unwilling to confront the president directly, and classified testimony would keep the information away from the American people entirely, so they chose transparency. Officers who spent their careers following orders, deciding that following orders had become complicity in the destruction of the institution they loved. That is not an impulsive decision. That is not political opportunism. That is a strategic calculation made over months by some of the most careful institutional thinkers in American public life. Let's talk about what comes next, because there are genuinely 2 paths from here. The first path is accountability. The Senate Armed Services Committee had already, before this letter was released, voted 11-0 in a bipartisan closed session to formally request that the Pentagon Inspector General launch an immediate investigation into the February 9th directive. That investigation, if it proceeds, will attempt to establish whether the directive existed, what it actually said, who issued it, and what operational consequences followed. If the investigation confirms the account presented in the letter, the legal and political implications are historic. Military families will have documented evidence that their loved one's safety was treated as a bargaining chip. Republicans in Congress will face an impossible choice between political loyalty and institutional credibility. And the legal exposure for officials involved could extend well beyond public embarrassment. The second path is the spiral. The White House response released at 4:23 p.m. today did not address the specific allegations. It did not dispute the existence of the February 9th directive. It did not provide alternative context or documentation. What it did was launch personal attacks against General Caldwell and Admiral Hartley by name, calling them, in the president's words on Truth Social, failures and losers who couldn't win wars and are probably being paid by Democrats to undermine a president who rebuilt the military they allowed to decay. When the response to specific documented allegations is personal attacks rather than factual dispute, when the logical move of simply releasing the actual directive to provide context doesn't happen, legal communication experts will tell you that's not a defense strategy. That's a signal that no factual defense is available. If the spiral path continues, if personal attacks replace accountability, if the investigation gets blocked or buried, if Republicans in Congress decide political loyalty outweighs the testimony of 38 decorated military leaders, the precedent set is catastrophic. Future presidents of any party will have learned that military operations can be conditioned on political loyalty without consequence. Future commanders will know that the path to promotion runs through political alignment, not operational excellence, and future adversaries will factor into their calculations the possibility that American military decisions are influenced by domestic political theater rather than strategic necessity. That is not a sustainable model for a country that depends on military credibility as a cornerstone of global security. Drop a comment below right now. I want to know, do you think accountability follows, or does this get buried? I read every single comment on this channel. Here's where we actually stand as of this evening. 38 military leaders with impeccable records, centuries of combined service, and no history of political involvement have publicly declared that operational military decisions were conditioned on political loyalty to the president. The Senate Armed Services Committee has voted bipartisan to request an Inspector General investigation. Constitutional scholars across the political spectrum have called the allegations, if substantiated, among the most serious civil-military crises in modern American history. 3 service members were wounded at a base that had requested defensive systems included in a delayed authorization package. And the White House response did not dispute a single specific fact. This is not theoretical. This is not a policy debate. This is a question about whether the most fundamental compact in American constitutional democracy, that the military serves the nation, not the political interests of whoever holds the presidency, still holds. And here's the thing. That compact has survived MacArthur. It survived Vietnam. It survived every crisis of civil-military relations in the last century. The question being asked right now is whether the institution is strong enough to survive this one. I genuinely don't know the answer, and I think anyone who tells you they do with certainty is not being honest with you. What I do know is that when career officers who've spent 30 or 40 years never once speaking publicly about a president decide that staying silent has become complicity, that moment deserves to be understood in its full weight, not filtered through partisan framing, not reduced to another episode in the news cycle. Understood. Smash that like button because it genuinely helps this analysis reach people who need it. Subscribe to Daily Brief if you haven't already. We cover these institutional stories with the depth and context they actually require, and leave me your answer in the comments to these questions. If the Inspector General investigation confirms the February 9th directive as described, what consequences are proportionate? Is there a version of accountability that both parties could accept? And if this moment passes without consequences, what does that tell every future president about the limits of commander-in-chief authority? Those aren't rhetorical questions. They're the ones that will define what kind of country emerges from whatever comes next. This story is far from over. Stay with Daily Brief.